Hi, my name is Manu, and I hope you're all keeping safe. Thank you so much for being here. And in terms of the format, Professor Dilip will talk for some time, and then we will, at the end of which, we will have some questions. You've asked some questions at the time of the registration, and also any questions that you ask during the YouTube live chat. We will be addressing those towards the end. Now, to begin with, I think this is a wonderful platform that has been initiated by some of the students at Ashoka University to foster engagement and reflection. We had Professor Debayan last week talking about the intricacies of data and policy. This week, we have Professor Dilip, who's going to be talking to us. Professor Dilip currently teaches Totalitarian Century for the YFs at Ashoka. He's a historian, author, and an academic, apart from being a very inspiring social activist. But any more than that, he has been an extraordinary teacher and guide to many of us.
I can't hear you. Okay.
So now, without losing any more time, I'm going to pass it on to Professor Dilip to start with his conversation. Professor.
Okay, thank you, Manu, and welcome to all of you. And I'm very happy to meet you in this manner, although we are living in very difficult times. Manu, please let me know if you're hearing me and if my voice is getting through or if there's any problem in communication. Can you hear me? Can you give me an affirmative that I'm getting through?
Yes, Professor Dilip, we can hear you.
Okay, fine. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So, we are living through very remarkable times. I've often had occasion to tell some of my younger friends that I've seen a few things in my lifetime, but I have never seen anything so uncanny as this. Incidentally, the word uncanny is itself very loaded. Freud has written a whole essay on the word uncanny. But to just sum it up, it means a mixture of something which is strange and familiar at the same time. So we'll talk about that later if we ever have time. But I wanted to say right at the beginning that, this is also an occasion for people of my generation to think back uh, to all the grievous things and world changing things that we may have seen. And it struck me once that the word nostalgia is a very uncanny kind of emotion. And it's uncanny because it passes to the young before they have lived, which is an interesting reflection. How is it that you have nostalgia for something without having experienced it? And one reason is that we are very close to our elders, our parents, or favorite uncles and aunts, and they were close to their own parents, etc. So there is a passage of memory. And of course, people pass on what is most important to them or what is dearest to them. And in the process, they remember certain things and forget certain things. And they're nostalgic about certain things. And certain things inspire kind of traumatic sensibility in them. So we pick up many things from our elders. And sometimes we have a sense of nostalgia for what they spoke of. I remember my father's home, ancestral home in Allahabad. And from him, I got a glimpse of that home, which was built in the 1920s. And of course, I remember my grandfather, who was born in the late 19th century, and I remember talking to him. So I remember, there are certain aspects of my mother's side of the family which were very, very interesting. I didn't know much about it until I visited certain places in Goa. My mother was from Goa. And so, to put it very briefly, I gathered a sense of nostalgia about the past. And some of the most important things in the previous century are things that also traumatize society at large. For instance, the partition of India, which my parents lived through, Maybe your grandparents lived through it. And even before that, the Second World War and the First World War and things that happened in the 1930s. So the whole century was full of certain very, very grievous events. And we developed some kind of memory about them. And why is this important? Because in none of all these memories can I recollect anything so strange as what is occurring now. Even though one does teach historically the existence of the Spanish flu, which happened immediately after the First World War, even though one does know that, and one teaches also the very grievous political and social conflicts that took place in the 1930s and thereafter. Even though I know all this, and many of you know it too, still there's something very unique about the moment that we are living through right now. Maybe we can talk about it a bit more. But it is a combination of political, economic, social, ecological, natural, medical, scientific, and pseudoscientific issues. It's all combined in one place. It's something that seemingly is invisible. A virus is invisible, but it's having very, very visible results all over. And it's the intersection point of many political and even philosophical issues. So it's forced us to consider and reconsider many of our habits of thought and practice. Who would have thought that we would be able to completely stop the machinery of modern industry? Who would have thought that in Delhi we would be breathing clean air, but also breathing clean air was accompanied by terrible tragedy unfolding not just in our country but all over the world? Who would have thought that um, a tiny invisible virus would cause us to completely reconsider our economic doctrines and philosophical doctrines? To give you just two examples, economically, there's one very interesting article which I posted on my blog, which had a very interesting line in it that just as there are no atheists on a sinking ship, so there are no free marketeers in a pandemic. Meaning thereby that the economic doctrine that of laissez-faire and that the state should never intervene in the economy, etc., is thrown overboard during a pandemic. And for example, the notion that we are living in a post-truth world and that there's no such thing as truth, and truth is different as per the viewpoint of the observer, etc., etc. This viewpoint also gets no traction in the midst of a pandemic. You have to face facts about what is happening to you. You have to recognize the medical realities. Of course, there are people who will deny them. It's a very strange and ironic reflection that in the USA, many evangelical Christian pastors who were claiming that Jesus will save us, who come to church, many of these people themselves have fallen victim tragically and passed away. So we are being forced to confront certain issues. And all this is happening simultaneously. It's a political crisis, an economic crisis, a medical crisis, a social crisis. And moreover, it is global. There's no part of the globe which is free from this. So it's forced us to consider in a very violent way almost, the fact that we are, after all, a human species. There is something in common between all of us, even though we have different histories, we have different cultures, we speak different languages, we have different political opinions. Nonetheless, we are all uniquely vulnerable. Each one of us is vulnerable. Of course, there are degrees of vulnerability. I am an elderly person, so I'm more vulnerable. Other people live in a different kind of climate, so they are less vulnerable. It could be anything, but basically, as human beings, we are vulnerable. So these are certain things that this pandemic has forced upon us. I'll try to summarize some of these and expand on a few of them if I can. Manu, please keep track of the time also and remind me when we are running close to about 45 to 50 minutes. So one is that it has provoked an awareness of the seamless connection between human beings, human society, animals, and nature. Nature being both animate and inanimate nature, both organic and inorganic nature. It's forced us to consider that there's a seamless link. So human beings are part of nature. They are also distinct from it. They're both. That's the problem. We are capable of actually destroying ourselves, and this is the problem that we have to face. That it's our own actions. It's not some God-given cataclysm that has happened. It's not quote unquote nature taking revenge on us or animal species taking revenge on us. These are all metaphysical ways of describing a fairly simple fact that certain sort of indiscriminate methods of animal husbandry, husbanding animals for the purpose of meat markets and putting them in close proximity, wild animals and domesticated animals being in close proximity to human beings. All these things have resulted in the phenomenon, which is not unique, which has happened before, of viruses which basically are animal viruses jumping across species. So there's a seamless connection. Point number one. Secondly, that locality is important. Local features, cultural features are important. Food habits of specific peoples and cultures are important. But you can say that locality has universal significance. So there's no necessary contradiction between locality and universality. There is a universal significance of locality. Locality is where universal things appear and manifest themselves. So the locality of great significance in everyday life, and the universal things are also of great significance in everyday life. Whether you're a rich person living in New York or whether you're a poor Indian laborer trekking from Bombay to Bihar, the fact is that you are doing so because you are both humanly exposed to something, some kind of danger. So, regardless of your locality, this pandemic has reminded us that we are part of one species, and moreover, that this species is part of nature. And by trampling upon nature in the particular way that we have done, whether it's our economic policies or whether it's our incessant commitment to warfare, because of all this, we have endangered not the planet but ourselves. I find it very ironic and amusing that people keep talking about saving the planet. The planet does not require saving. The planet is going nowhere, and the planet will remain, except that the sustainable aspect of the planet, that is, that aspect of the planet which is hospitable to us, which welcomes us, which permits us to live and thrive, that aspect of the planet and nature will be undermined, and so we are undermining our own existence, social existence. Thirdly, it forces us to recognize that there is no Muslim virus and Hindu virus. There is no American virus and Chinese virus. There is no virus that is in accord with a particular religion or community. Whether we are Hindus, Muslims, Christians, or whether we are of this caste or that caste, whether we live in this country or that country, we are all exposed to it. So it again, as I said, this is a point I made earlier. This is a virus that has forced our humanity, forced us to face our humanity. Thirdly, fourthly, there is a tremendous growth of a sense of human solidarity as well. Of course, sometimes in India, when we live in India, we feel despairing. We think that each and everything is reduced to a Hindu Muslim issue. But also, we should remember that there are millions of people who are actually reaching out to one another, trying to help one another. This is also happening. So, we find both habits. We find some of the most base and evil habits or instincts of human beings coming to the surface: boycotting of health workers, boycotting of nurses and doctors, maltreating people, throwing them away from a house when they need help. We find that. At the same time, we also find lots of mutual help associations, lots of people gathering money. I know many of you, of my students, many of you are also doing this. So that is very commendable. I know some friends of mine called me from England, and they said that we have mutual aid societies here. Online, anybody can say, I'm an elderly person, I'm lacking these medicines, I'm lacking this food, and within 10 minutes he or she will get an answer and say that you can find this lying on your doorstep, please pick it up. So we find the growth of social solidarity. I must also tell you, although the person concerned does not want me to mention her name, that one amongst us, an Ashoka alumni, is a doctor who works with MSF, Medicine Sans Frontier, and she was a student of mine also. I admire her a great deal. She's working with affected people all over the world. She has been in Spain recently, she has been in Iran, and she's an exceedingly brave person. So there is this solidarity as well. Human decency, therefore, is something that we can see surfacing during the time of a crisis. And this human decency has nothing to do with one's political affiliation, one's doctrinal preferences, whether one is leftist, rightist, conservative, liberal, whatever it is. It really makes no difference. This is something I've seen in life, and this is something which I would like to pass on to all of you. Human friendship and love are over and beyond doctrinal differences. You should welcome it and you should embrace it. And if you want to talk to anybody about the ideas about the world, you should use this friendship as a basis and not let the doctrine undermine the friendship, but use the friendship to establish greater understanding. So this human decency is something that we see surfacing during the time of a social crisis like this. Then again, there is another thing that must be mentioned about science. I do not have any hostility to science, rationality, etc., or technology for that matter. I do believe that it can be misused, and it has been misused for militarism, waging war among people, etc. It can be misused. You can use science for making poison gas. You can use science for making atomic bombs. You can use science for very, very evil purposes. But after all, the medical science that is telling us what is wrong, the scientific efforts that are telling us that the climate is deteriorating, the science that tells us that carbon dioxide emissions are bad for the climate and bad for our health. All this is also science. So science is simply an inevitable part of life. We live and we learn about nature and the life around us. We learn to manipulate these things. And of course, it is better for us if we manipulate them in harmony with nature rather than in a manner which is aggressive. That is the effort to develop science. Scientific knowledge is something which is to be welcomed. But science is not our Lord and Master, and science should be subjugated by good values. We should not use science in a proud effort to conquer nature, as it were. This conquest, this idea of conquest, is what is problematical. Then, so in short, what I'm trying to say is that scientific knowledge can be used for good as well as evil ends. When it comes to viruses, we cannot keep up the pretense of something called post-truth. There is no such thing as post-truth. If someone says that all views are as good or as bad as all other views, that simply will not hold during a pandemic. Now you'll find that in many parts of the world, there are groups of people who are identified as anti-vaxxers. They're anti-vaccination. They think that vaccination causes more illness, etc. Now, there is adequate scientific evidence to show that vaccinations do protect human beings. And simply praying to Jesus or praying to God, when your child is ill and dying of a fever, is not going to cut it. You have to do something. And so even the anti-vaccination people are beginning to revise their opinions. It is really tragic that in a country like the USA, you have well over 50,000, half a lakh people have already died. It's a terrible human tragedy. What's even worse is that the sale of guns is going up in that country. And there are still people who are, instead of showing any empathy for the people who have suffered, still are engaged more in building up some kind of political repartee on this basis. This is tragic. All this tells me that this shutdown, this lockdown that has happened, all this tells me that we can indeed confront the problems of the human race if we want to. If we are sufficiently motivated to confront these problems, we can. And the lockdowns all over the world have shown that it's possible to do something. Unfortunately, these things have not been thought out carefully enough. Sometimes lockdowns have happened blindly without due consideration to the impact they might have, without due warning and adequate warning to people, without giving them adequate facility to eat and rest and go home if they want to go home. So these are all the specific aspects of these of the measures taken by governments. They indicate, and as far as I'm concerned, these aspects reflect the unthinking nature of governance. The fact that the governors, or I mean, various parts of the world, you have governments which are even denying. For instance, Bolsonaro is insisting that there's no such thing. We can conquer it very easily, etc. This is causing a political crisis. The same thing is happening in the USA, which you must have followed. So we can confront these issues. In fact, the very fact that the whole world is now embroiled in some effort or the other to confront the virus shows that it can undertake collective action to confront the climate emergency as well. Now, that's why we need debate and rational debate. Of course, debate will have lots of differences of opinion, but all the more reason we have to debate, because these things are all linked up together. I strongly believe that militarism, ultranationalism, climate emergency, pandemic, and virus, these are all linked together. They are not separate issues. For instance, I heard a friend the other day on a Google chat saying that the climate emergency has caused the melting of permafrost. I'm sure all of you know about this. So melting of permafrost, apparently there's some part of Tibet in a glacier where the permafrost had not yet melted, but they drilled down several hundred feet and they discovered viruses, completely 28 new genuses of viruses, which had not even surfaced, but they would surface at some point or the other, which would confront humanity with even worse problem. Completely unknown viruses, which may have been frozen for tens of thousands of years. So in this sense, and why is the permafrost melting? It's melting because of global warming. Why is global warming taking place? Because of the uncontrolled burning up of fossil fuels, and the military industry is using up industrial complex is producing aircraft. Even the airlines industry, all these things are burning fossil fuels at an unprecedented rate, and all this is contributing to global warming. You know that the whole continent of Australia was on fire a few months ago. So in short, all these things are connected to each other. They're not separate issues, they're connected issues. So we should keep that in mind. And if we have to confront all these problems, we have to do it collectively. So these are just some issues that I feel the pandemic has thrown up before us. Now, what I would like to put forward my ideas on what I think is necessary to be done. Of course, they are fairly simple ideas, and I'm not an expert, I'm not a medical person, and there are people, or an economist for that matter, and there are people far more knowledgeable than me on these matters, and they can tell you about it, and I'm sure you can explore the web for more information about the economy, about medical science, etc., etc. But what I want to say is that we need to rethink certain of our long held beliefs. For instance, the phenomenon of growth. Economic growth is supposed to be good for every nation. I would say that economic growth is not good for society, that economic growth has to be tempered. We have to be careful as to what is growing and for what reason it is growing and at what cost is growing. Simple use of language like this is a semantic jugglery. We say we need jobs, but what jobs do you need? After all, the arms industry also provides jobs. So it's not just that we need jobs. We also need to think about what kind of jobs we need. So economic growth is not a panacea. It's not something that has to be taken for granted. We have to be very careful, and unlimited growth on limited resources is going to lead to a disaster. That is what is happening. The simplest example is the unlimited use of plastics. So much so that, and not just plastics, microplastics are polluting the oceans. They found microplastic pollution even in the polar ice caps. So this is a very dangerous situation, and we have to confront it. So we need to now, therefore, rethink all our doctrinal approaches. Everybody needs to rethink, and they should do so in a non-polemical manner. I'll try to expand on this. One, to begin with, human beings are unique in one sense. They always have the capacity for new beginnings. This is something that Hannah Arendt has most famously spoken about, but we won't go into naming great people and names and so on. I just want to concentrate on the ideas. Human beings are unique in the sense that they can make new beginnings. They are capable of novel departures. So this is something that can be again used for both good and ill. And so there's no logic of history, as it were. There's no inexorable logic of history which is leading us either to doom and disaster or to progress and utopia. There isn't any such thing. It's not that bad things having happened once that we will have recovered from them. After the First World War, people thought that now warfare will be put to an end. Finally, human beings have learned their lesson. They set up the League of Nations, and within 20 years, there was a Second World War. So after the Second World War, people thought that the United Nations was set up, and there were various efforts to prevent genocide. Conventions were passed against genocide and for human rights. The United Nations was set up. And nonetheless, there has been unending war from the end of the Second World War onwards. I don't want to go into the details. I've written about all this elsewhere. So, as one of my friends in my college days very ironically remarked, he said, human beings don't know anything, learn anything from history. The only thing we learn from history is that we do not learn anything from history. Now, I wish that were not true. My profession is a historian, but sometimes, sadly enough, I have to admit that there is no guarantee that we will learn anything from history. We may and we may not. So this is something we have to keep in mind. We are capable of new departures if we want to. Hannah Arendt used to say that every child that is born is a new departure, is an expression of novelty, is a new beginning, because every child is marks a new step in human experience. So that is why we have to think about our situation as an opportunity as well. It's not just a crisis, it's also an opportunity. Every crisis is an opportunity. This opportunity is being seized by certain people. I don't have to go into any names, but all over the world you find autocratic, authoritarian tendencies, and they're using this crisis to put together their own ideological storyline and push for even further erosion of human rights, democratic rights, liberties, etc. So you can use a crisis for anything, and though people who are authoritarian inclined, they're using it. And to give you a very simple example, this virus was first detected by a 34-year-old Chinese doctor, whom, as a matter of conscience and scientific discipline and method, he told the authorities in that particular Wuhan hospital that this is a dangerous new virus. And he was arrested by the police. He was persecuted. He was made to sign documents saying that he has been trying to defame the Chinese People's Republic, etc., etc. Now, this is an example of sheer tyranny. And I remember asking my students once in class, do you think the phrase tyranny is bad for society? Do you think this is a fact or is it a value? We were having a discussion about the so-called distinction between facts and values. So is tyranny bad for society? Now here's a clear case of tyranny being bad for a society. It is both a fact and a value. So had that person been listened to earlier, perhaps this crisis could have been avoided. So we do need, and he himself, before he died, he did write about it, and many doctors and many people in China have spoken about the fact that a tyrannical mode of governance and a tyrannical and authoritarian political system is not good for the Chinese people, nor for that matter is it good for the rest of humanity. You don't need democracy, you need free speech, you need free airing of opinions, no matter what those opinions are, as long as you do not resort to violence and beating each other up, you should listen carefully and thrash these things out. So this is something that I wanted to stress. So this leads me to the second point, that um, informed conversation requires some degree of tolerance, some degree of patience, a capacity to listen to different points of view, and to recognize ambivalence and ambiguity. Binary vocabulary, by which I mean black and white, binary vocabulary, Manichaean vocabulary, polemical speech rather than civil discourse. These are modes of ideological speech. And as I have pointed out in my class, often ideological speech is a form of silence, because you may be speaking, but actually nobody is listening. So you need to surpass that. And unfortunately, in the middle of a pandemic, we cannot afford ideological speech. We just can't go on and on beating our political drum to point, to try to score political points. We have to face the fact that this is something that surpasses immediate factional political interests. So therefore, I'm saying that we need to change our habits of speech. This is one reason I took a whole course called the Ideology Seminar. We need to change our habits of speech. I'll give you some more examples of this. And although it might seem that I'm pushing some kind of line, I'm not. I'm simply trying to get to certain basic realities that we are facing. I'll give you an example of some this kind of binary vocabulary. For instance, repeatedly one finds among opinion makers in our mass media a dichotomy, a binary choice being placed before us of people versus the economy. Should we be bothered about people, or should we be bothered about the economy? This is astonishing piece of rhetoric. I really find it astonishing. What is the economy? Actually, this proves the point that the economy seems to exist in some stratospheric realm. What is the economy if it is not made by people? People are those who run the economy. So this brings us to the point: is the economy for people, or people are for the economy? This is the same. This is the word resources, human resources, as if human resources, mineral resources, forest resources, water resources are all resources. Resources for what? So people versus economy is a false dichotomy. It's a false binary. It's a way of conflating issues and not addressing issues. The Indian economy consists of millions upon millions of informal workers. They are people, and they run the informal economy. Now you have to figure out why the Indian economy requires more than 90% of the working class is living in the informal and living and working in the informal sector. This is a question you should be asking, but nobody asks it, or very few people ask it and discuss it. I'm not an economist, but this is a simple question that I would like to pose to my friends who know more about economics than me. So this is one example. There's this kind of people versus economy dichotomy is also something that passes over the question of capital. Mind you, I'm not referring to capitalists. I have no hostility to capitalists. Capitalists comes in various shapes and sizes. So there are many small capitalists who are running very small businesses and who are treating their workers perfectly decently, etc. But there are also many rascals in the higher reaches of the economy who conduct their business behind closed doors and who are doing many things which are illegal and harmful for the ecology and harmful for the environment. So the point is not capitalists. The point is capital. It seems that if we talk about people versus the economy, we forget that there is something called capital, and capital seems to be running on autopilot. And the very simple example is that if we know that the destruction of the Amazon forest is bad for the climate, why is it still going on? So we are living on borrowed time, and time cannot be nationalized. The time of an election cycle in Brazil or America is the time of their national politics. But the time that we all live, the time that is measured in terms of global warming and the ozone layer, etc., that is not national time. It is the time for the whole species and the whole planet. So there are different ways of looking at nature, looking at the climate, And certainly, we should remember that the existence of something called capital is has to be taken into account. Otherwise, we will not be able to understand all the things that are taking place. I mean, I can give you more information on this, but we don't have time, and hopefully we can continue the discussion later. Also, I've given Manu several links to information that you can follow up if you want to. Now, I mean, to give you some examples of this terrible iniquity in human life, you have all heard of Piketty. Piketty has written books on this. But when you have one top 1% of the population owning 45% of the global personal wealth, and bottom 50% of the population owning less than 1% of the global personal wealth, then there is a problem here. You can't pretend that there is no problem and that the only it's a communist propaganda. Find out the reality if that is not true, and try to answer what the reason could possibly be. So we need therefore to think about these phenomena. I'll give you a few more interesting statistics. For example, um, this may seem funny also, but it's also tragic. The American habit and the Western habit of using toilet paper rather than water to wash themselves after their ablutions is something that is tremendously ecologically destructive. Some facts I discovered recently was that Americans alone use 36 billion rolls of toilet paper every year. 15 million trees are cut down for this purpose, and 437 billion gallons of water, not to speak of tons and tons of bleach, etc., used for this purpose. Now, if you have to destroy 15 million trees every year just to clean yourself, then it is a problem. If you simply change certain habits, it might make a difference. Similarly, if you the militarism that is running amok, it is still carrying on. Incidentally, military expenditure is increasing. If some of you are interested, you can please follow this up. There's a website and an institution called the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And for 2018, they gave the following figures. The total world military expenditure rose to 18 trillion, $1,822 billion in 2018, which is an increase of 2.6% from the previous year. And the five biggest spenders on military military expenditure, military budgets, were America, China, Saudi Arabia, India, and France. And these five countries accounted for 60% of world military expenditure. So this rise of military expenditure, even after the end of the Cold War, after the Cold War ended, people were talking about there would be a peace dividend. Military expenditure would go down, but it has not gone down. It has risen. It's still going on, and they're now inventing even more and more deadly weapons and deadly rockets, etc., etc. So this is something that your generation will have to think about. I mean, many of us have spent a lifetime in various kinds of political activism, but this is something that we need an international movement to confront this problem. Thirdly, we need to move economic doctrine away from monetarist doctrines, neoliberal dogma. We need to move it away. After the end of the Cold War, there has been an onslaught on labor rights. It's almost as if labor is a problem. Everybody talks about reforming labor law, as if the working class is the problem. How would you like to function the economy if workers don't exist? I mean, this habit of invisibilizing working class people, suddenly it has come to us in this pandemic that literally millions of our fellow countrymen and women are walking home. It's such a terrible tragedy. And they're dying on the way. And people going home are saying, we are never going back. Now, can we be bothered to think about the fact that in one of the world metropolitan centers such as Bombay, there are huge slums like Dharavi which have 1 million people living in them. Why is it 7 decades after independence that people have to live in such unhygienic conditions? Why are they living there anyway? And whom do they serve? We have such hostility towards poor people in this country, almost as if they are the root cause of disease, and they are the people who need clean water, they need clean dwelling spaces, but they don't get it. So we have to consider why this kind of economy is being put, why is it so necessary for this kind of social stratification to persist? And why do our economists and pundits of the economy neglect this sector of the population? And mind you, it is not small. The informal sector accounts for something like 400 million people. It could be more if you include all the families. If you include people who are fisher folk in the inland fisheries, if you include people who are landless agricultural laborers, etc., you'll see the way in which economic doctrine and language is being transformed. For instance, up to even 20, 25 years ago, we would never hear the word farmer. People were peasants, and there were poor peasants, there were rich peasants, and there were landless peasants. Today we talk of farmers. But when you talk of farmers, farmers are those who possess some land. You don't talk about the something like 40 to 50% of the population in the agrarian areas who are basically not farmers. They're workers, but they don't come into the picture. So we have to consider why the social discourse is so anti-labor. This has to be placed. I mean, you don't have to be a communist to remind yourself that these people are also human beings, you know. So this is something I wanted to place before you. So there is a kind of neoliberal dogma which keeps on telling us that we must grow. Growth is very important, and which forces a certain kind of vocabulary even into the classroom. Now you see, all of you are not my students; you're customers, and I'm not a teacher, but I'm a a service deliverer or something or the other. It's nothing of the kind. I am your teacher, and you are my students. Of course, you'll cease to be my students at some point. That's fine, but you can't force all of society into the structure of a factory floor. And certain people are trying to run universities as if they are corporations. They are not corporations. So this is something that I wanted to bring to your attention as well. Now, education requires non-ideological speech. Let me make this point to you more clear. Even if I have certain preferences in terms of philosophy, doctrine, ideology, whatever it is, in the classroom, I cannot force you to agree with me. The discussion and the debate that takes place before us, at least for the duration of the debate and the discussion, there has to be complete equality and dignity between the participants. It may be that you respect a person because of his or her age and experience. That's fine. That's only proper. But there is a certain dignity of human communication which has to be preserved. And that's what I mean by non-polemical, non-ideological speech and debate. This is something which is very, very important, and which we should keep in mind. We should also counter the misuse of social media, misuse of electronic communication. What is happening in this pandemic is that those who want to increase the power of the state over every aspect of our lives, they are being given an opportunity to do so, and they can do so in the name of fighting the pandemic. This is something we should be very careful about. It's not happening just in our country, it's happening all over the world in different degrees. So we should beware that the extraordinary measures that governments have to take for the purpose of combating a pandemic, those extraordinary measures do not become the part of ordinary life. Emergency should not be made permanent. This is a way of political thinking which I've taught about in class also, but that's a separate issue. Then when you make the emergency situation into the norm, then we are living in a permanent emergency. And that is another name for totalitarianism, where we will no longer be able to express our feelings, our opinions. And mind you, this has very bad consequences for society, just as the case of the Chinese doctor proved. Democracy is good for society. A free airing of opinions is good for society. Accountability of people who are in authority, it's good for society. People should not act as if they're above the law. People should not act as if having attained a position of high authority in the government that they will have to remain there all their life. No, this is not good for society. Democracy is better for society if we want to survive as a species. So that's one thing. Then again, I want to say one other issue I wanted to raise, and we're coming to the close of what I had to say, is that there is a kind of, along with ideology, is a phenomenon of what I would call methodological nationalism. By methodological nationalism, I mean the habit of looking at all problems and their solutions through the lens of the nation state in which we happen to be living. But keep in mind, surely the pandemic has made clear to us that the virus does not respect national boundaries and frontiers. It's of no concern. When we are combating something like this, we cannot afford to remain nationalists. Therefore, the question of a national vaccine or national ownership of a vaccine and bothering only about our own people or becoming hostile to other people. Some people are becoming very hostile to Chinese or people who look as if they're Chinese, even within our country. People who look as if they come from the Northeast are being attacked. But on the other hand, in China, people who come from Africa are being treated with hostility. So this habit has to stop. This pandemic has shown, if we don't learn even in this pandemic, then I'm afraid we are a lost case. But as I said, there are signs of hope. There are many, many people who are showing solidarity. But this methodological nationalism has to be discarded. You cannot combat this virus or this pandemic by the use of nationalism. And also, you have to have a different sense of your social priorities. People who work in the medical field, people who work in hospitals, people who are doctors and researchers and nurses and caregivers, they should be treated with respect. Surely they are deserving of more respect than celebrities whose names we keep hearing every other day in the newspapers. Why are they not more deserving? Why don't they? Why should not more money be spent on their salaries? Why do we not bother about reaching healthcare to the poorer sections of the population? This is where I would like to have people to discuss the issue of capitalism and neoliberalism. On what ground do children in a Gorakhpur hospital, just because they come from a poor background, be deprived of oxygen cylinders if they are suffering from encephalitis? Why? Why should this happen? Are children responsible for the class and the economic strata into which they are born? They are not responsible. So there is a case to be made, and I really don't care whether you call yourself a capitalist or a socialist or a social democrat. It really doesn't matter. What matters is whether you accept the fact that healthcare, education, and access to clean water and food should be decommercialized. So instead of having a discussion about socialism and capitalism, which I'm quite happy to do, but we don't have time and it should be done in the proper arena. Instead of that, we should first ask ourselves about the question of regulation. Should there be regulation? Should there be regulation of pollutants which are being put into the atmosphere and into the water, into the groundwater, etc.? If there is no regulation, if mining practices or the production of chemicals or the production of heavy machinery or the production of petroleum or the use of depleted uranium, etc., or if all this is not going to be regulated, then what guarantee do we have that we will not produce more and more poison in the surface of the earth? We don't have any guarantee. So you cannot have untrammeled capitalism. You can't have untrammeled socialism either. It has to be regulated. So the question arises, who will regulate it? How will the regulators be safeguarded from unwarranted interference and threats? These are real political issues. If you do not have independent authorities who are fearless in pointing out the violation of environmental regulations, then you cannot have a functioning democracy and you cannot have a healthy industry. Now, various people point to the number of rules and regulations we have, and a friend of mine asked me the other day that about the environmental protections in our country. Now, I don't know much about that. I can tell you one thing, and I've talked to senior officials who are my friends also, retired officials. They said the devil is in the detail. Look to the offices where the environmental clearances are being provided. How many people are there in the offices, and is there sufficient staff to deal with all the applications? Look to the labor inspection directorate. How many people are there to see to it that the labor hazards in laboring conditions and mines are actually being properly regulated? They're not. So if you go into details about regulation, you will find a great deal. It will give you a great political education. You look at the environmental record of, let us say, the American government or even our government. Look to the number of regulations that have been deregulated. Look to why all the loopholes are being provided for polluting industries, and you get an idea of what is going on. So these are some other issues. So finally, what I want to do is to make an appeal to your generation. Of course, it cuts across generations, and I know some activists who are even senior to me, whom I admire for their untiring efforts. They've fought all their lives for more humane politics. But I would say that it is time for you to grow out of the nationalist mindset. That does not mean that uh, you should not respect your fellow countrymen and women, or that you should have any disrespect for your national cultures and language. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you have to transcend it. Just as the virus has transcended it, you must also transcend it. You have to get beyond methodological nationalism. You cannot nationalize God. You cannot nationalize time. You cannot nationalize the climate. You cannot nationalize the polar ice caps. You cannot nationalize the Amazon forest. You cannot nationalize the oceans, the Pacific Oceans. You can't nationalize these things. The air is not national. What we breathe is not Hindu and Muslim air. So I'm asking you all to rise above this, to transcend this kind of nationalism, and to pay all the attention you need to pay to local culture, local language, etc., etc. But at the same time, try to point out in all your conversations that there is something higher, that there is something called nobility and decency and virtue, that there is something called looking after the environment as a means only of looking after ourselves, even of having some respect for the nature in which we have been brought up, and to also have some consideration for the future, because you cannot keep buying time from future generations. And this is why I respect this young woman, Greta Thunberg, who's just a child and who's risen above her own immediate circumstances to lead a climate strike movement all over the world. You should join them. You should make links with people across boundaries, across whether it's community boundaries or national boundaries or whatever boundaries. You will find that there are people who respond to you. Even if they don't speak your language, they'll respond to you. But no time is to be lost. You must build up these networks as soon as possible. Confront the major issues, that is, of militarism, military conflict, environmental pollution, climate change, all these things. Confront them, because if you don't confront them, and with a fair degree of determination, not hostility to people, but with a fair degree of determination, then you will not be able to have much of a future for yourselves. Thank you all for listening to me. I'm very, very happy that Mindsperm Masterclass has taken this initiative. I don't know many of them, but Deepak and Ayush Khosla and others, they've all taken a very praiseworthy initiative. During the time of a pandemic, one doesn't have chance to meet one's students, but at least this is better than nothing. I hope we can keep up the conversation, and I stop with that, and we have ample time for a discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this. I'm thinking this has brought up a lot of questions, and I think all of them need a lot of reflection. And thinking about what you said about there being no logic of history, and I was thinking about how it relates closely to how we think about when we start to feel like there is almost a logic to history is when we despair about the state of affairs, about what happens in the future. And I think to we have to recall and realize again and again that we have the capacity to begin again. I think I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about what you said about the divide between people and economy. I think it's a very important question that we need to ask ourselves, and we need to answer it in ways we take action, we make policies. I think the conversation about factory flow and how everything seems to take the form of a factory flow is a very pertinent question to think about, because we become parts of the factory flow if we allow that to happen to us. And then I think methodological nationalism is something that we really should think more about. There's so many things to think of within methodological nationalism. And yeah, so thank you so much for all of these questions that have come up. I have a lot of students asked a lot of questions, and I'm going to sort of put some together and ask you some of them. I think one of the most prominent questions that students have been asking has to do with all of us coming from the position of students, of activists, of young people who are working out there. And I think the question is, it has to do with the fact that there had already been an
I missed that. Your voice isn't coming through. It stopped. I can't hear you. What's happened?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So, the question is with respect to, say, us being students or activists or generally young people. And a lot of us are anxious about the fact that there was already an environment of protest, an environment of anxiety in the country, even before this happened. And when this comes, there was already anxieties around surveillance, around authoritarianism, around communalism, hyper nationalism. And with this, there is a pressure to comply to what is authoritarian, but at the same time, there is also a desire to resist some things. There is a desire to resist what's being done, things that are wrong. Let's say with respect to UAPA arrests or the absence of transparency in a lot of aspects of this crisis. So there are anxieties about what does it mean to take action, and what's passivity in this case. As students, as citizens, how do we resist, how do we protest, and how do we, what does this crisis do to the future of all of that was happening before the crisis? So that's what.
Yeah, this is a very important question, and maybe we would need a whole hour to discuss it. But the fact is that yes, one needs to answer some things about this immediately. My very simple rule about democracy has always been this: use it or lose it. So yes, we are facing unprecedented crackdowns, etc. But also, this is the time when there are many people who are also feeling very vulnerable. What happens when people feel very vulnerable and fearful is that they become almost instinctive in their reactions, and they instinctively turn to something which is familiar. So some person in an American small town in the Midwest will turn to their church pastor, and the church pastor will tell them, no, no, just pray to God, come to church, forget about social distancing, everything will be all right. Then they will learn that this is not the case. So what happens in a trauma is that a trauma becomes the opportunity to rethink. Now, it's not inevitable. It's not inevitable. But there are sufficient number. You yourself, Manu, are you hearing me? Am I getting
Yes, sir.
through?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you.
Just now, and you can share that at some point with your friends and acquaintances, that you yourself encountered an opportunity to put forward different points of view to people close to you, and you managed to get through. So one first point is that if there are people who are showing some tendencies of human decency, and I can assure you there are lots of people, and you all must be aware of it. Therefore, I know people who are least interested in politics. There are some of my friends who are retired senior army officers. They are not interested in politics, but they are going out of their way to do something for the working people in their colonies and the bastis, and distributing food, trying to see to it that they don't get mistreated. They're doing all this work. And there are people who are middle class or upper middle class, and they're doing it. It's possible, therefore, even in a crisis, to confront ideas which we disagree with and try to work around them in some way. Many people, if you leave aside some kind of political doctrinal discussion, if you simply talk about helping people in need, after all, people who sit in a langar in a gurdwara, of course, nowadays you can't have them, but people who sit in a langar in a gurdwara and are giving food to people, they don't ask those people coming there, what is your religion, what is your name, what is your doctrine, what is party do you vote for? They don't, they just give them food. So these are starting points. If you look around you, you will find starting points of human decency. And those are the points on which we have to go back to basics in that sense. Because whatever doctrinal preferences we have, they become meaningless if they don't take human beings into account. It's not that we want to convince everybody. We simply want to have a less tension-ridden life. We want to have a less disease life. So there is an opportunity to place these problems. And yes, there is a growth of surveillance, etc., etc. You have to confront it. I mean, I know there are journalists who are resisting, and if the mainstream media is forcing you out, then your generation has access to a completely transformed media than my generation has. I belong to the generation we still wrote letters by hand. Nowadays, even sending an email is considered to be, Paleolithic. So basically, you are capable of communicating to a very wide audience all over the world. Of course, there are people misusing it, but you can use it, and you can counter the propaganda campaigns. You can put forward different points of view. You see, so and different ways of looking interpretations of what is going on around us. And in a crisis, people do have a tendency to try to look to different points of view also, especially if they are being challenged. So, well, I can't answer this question very thoroughly, but all I will say is that there's no life without optimism. And if you wish to go on living and get out, you'll have to get out of your social sphere and go and meet people. Otherwise, for instance, you would not be sitting and listening to me either if you were not concerned. So we cannot pretend to ourselves that everything will sort itself out. It won't. It will sort itself out if we make an effort. And I'm sure you're capable of making the effort. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There's also this question about nationalism, which one of the students asked, and it's an interesting one in the sense that they wanted to understand, because of this virus, there is suddenly this invisible enemy. So the first part of the question has to do with how there was a call for a war against terrorism at some point, and now there is this call for the war against this invisible virus. So that is the first part of the question. And the second part of the question has to do with when we say it's a war against the virus. It has created a lot of anxieties about the other. It has created anxieties about moving across countries, about traveling, even about another body. That's, if I go out, I'll be anxious about just another person right next to me. So we wanted to understand what is the future. What does the future look like in terms of nationalism, in terms of nation states and borders? Because there's a bleak way of looking at it where borders would harden even more. There would be a lot more.
Yeah,
This,
yeah.
yeah.
That's a very good question. Very good question. Because in the immediate sense, there is a closing in. In the immediate sense, what is happening is that we are not even stepping outside the house, let alone stepping outside the country. So there is an immediate sensibility of drawing lines, drawing more borders, increasing the number of frontiers, not only between nation and nation, but between locality and locality. So the sense of drawing lines in the sand is increasing. The sense of inwardness is increasing. At the same time, it's a point that has to be repeated. It's a rational point. It's a scientific fact that this virus is going across all these borders. And this virus is not simply a Chinese virus. You see, neither was the Spanish flu a Spanish. So this is not something that can be tackled. We are doing firefighting right now. We are trying to stop the spread of the disease, and that also we are doing in methods which are backfiring because of the large scale exodus of poor people from slums. And so social distancing, the aim of social distancing is lost if you mistreat people in this manner, if you don't prepare them. But that's a separate subsidiary question. The point is that you are doing immediate firefighting, and that firefighting seems to have increased the number of borders. But ironically, the other point is, the other side of the same coin is that it's an international pandemic. It's a pandemic. It's not just a local disease. It can be countered only on an international scale. So that means that medical science people have to help each other out. If they have certain codes, genetic codes of viruses and all, they have to pass these on to one another. In short, there has to be collaboration between human beings in the scientific community, in the medical community, and among all of us. There has to be collaboration, not drawing more borders, but breaking down those borders. So therefore, it's a very ironical situation where the immediate step is to close in, and the actual solution is to stop, overcome these borders. So what I'm saying is that you need to have a sense of what is immediate and a sense of what can actually help heal us. For example, global warming is not going to end by taking action only in a national sphere. Of course, you have to take action wherever you are, but you also have to keep in mind that this is not going to go away unless all over the world this fossil fuel consumption declines. So it's a combination of two things. We have to keep in mind that there are local circumstances in which we act, and we also have to keep in mind that it's a pandemic, and that if we don't take international action, Noam Chomsky has even written that internationalism or extinction. So as a species, if we can prevent the pollution of our rivers, that's a very good thing. But if other countries are producing enough fossil fuel, burning enough fossil fuels to destroy the Himalayan glaciers, it's not going to help us. The Amazon is only technically Brazilian, the Amazon forest. But actually, if it has an effect on the whole world, it's one of the lungs of the world, then it's not simply Brazilian. That's the point I want to make. This distinction between the local and the global has to be transcended.
Thank you, sir. There is another, closely related to this is what you had mentioned earlier about decommercializing of certain things. There is academic work, there is the relationship of a student and a teacher, there is the scientific community which interests itself with learning, with knowledge, and then the role of history. So we were curious about what is the role of academia in these times, what is the role of the scientific community, and if you could talk.
If you could form, I've lost you there. If you could form.
If you could talk more about decommercializing in terms of how, say, pharmaceutical industry, there's just this simple frustration that how could this happen at a time like this when there are millions dying? Capitalism continues to create roadblocks to what can save so many lives. So if you could talk more about that and about the role of academia or communities that are engaged with knowledge building and knowledge sharing.
Yeah, well, this is a very important issue, and the fact is that just a day or two ago, I posted an article written by a scientist, an American scientist called Katie Marvel. She wrote something called "I am a mad scientist." It's a very interesting little piece, and everybody should read it. And she says one of the things that has really made her angry. She said many of her friends, even relatives, are saying, "Oh, you should be very happy now." And she said, "Why do you think I should be happy? This is a world tragedy. I'm not happy, but I'm very angry that you never listen. That whenever we try to talk sense, nobody's listening." So what she's saying is that she's also angry at the timidity of certain academicians and scientists. They're too timid. They don't talk back. So we have allowed facts to be overtaken, scientific data to be overtaken. Now, of course, there are differences among scientists, and all scientists are not, angels. There are many scientists who even sell themselves out. That's why all the more reason for a democratic climate. You can't have a situation in which people have a free run of propaganda and nobody is able to criticize them. I have given examples even in class where a company which is actually donating money to climate denial is also producing advertisements for itself as if it is a very green oriented and green conscious company. The same company which is actually indulging in oil spills is also having a propaganda campaign to show how green they are. So this kind of thing has to be criticized openly. So if you have the simple reason is that we have allowed politics and a certain kind of polemical atmosphere to overcome our respect for truth. Now, if you say that truth is all a completely bogus, then you might as well be echoing Donald Trump. Donald Trump can even say that if you inject yourself with Dettol, you'll get better. No, you cannot function like this. So you have to have the space. Now, as I said, in China, the disaster began because one of the reasons, certainly, for this disaster is that nobody listened to the doctor. He was subjected to police action instead of being listened to. You can discuss his ideas. You can prove him wrong. You can say, all right, let's see what he has to say. No, you call in the police. This is what I am saying. And of course, it is happening, but we should stand up to it. No, more and more people should stand up to it and say, no, this is wrong. We will not take it. You can't say I'm anti-national simply because I'm criticizing the government of India. I have every right to do it. It's my right. And it's my duty as an academician. So, of course, academicians should not be abusive. They should not indulge in factionalism. They should be responsible in their public utterances. Yes, of course, we should be. But at the same time, we have to speak what we consider to be the truth. If there is something wrong in economic policy or political philosophy, one should be free to say it. So the role of academicians and intellectuals, look, I can do nothing better than to point you to a piece written by Noam Chomsky years and years ago, which I put on my blog also. It's called The Responsibility of Intellectuals. It's a very simple statement. The responsibility of intellectuals is to speak the truth and expose lies. Now it's a tall order because it means that we have some idea of what truth and lies means, but it's fairly simple also. We have to stand by our understanding of truth, and we have to be capable of changing our minds if we are confronted with incontrovertible evidence to the contrary. And we have to do it publicly. Academicians and the student committee community have a big role to play. The student communities had a big role to play in the Indian national movement. They had a big role to play in the movements in the 19th century, in 1848, or even thereafter. All along, you have young people and student communities have had a big role to play in bringing about historical changes, and that's no less true today as it was ever.
Thank you, sir. With this, I think we're coming to a close of our discussion. And as always happens, I wish I could ask a lot more questions and continue this conversation. I hope I would love to ask more questions, and people who are listening.
I am quite happy if we still have 5-10 minutes, but if it's drawing to an end, it's up to you. I don't mind answering more questions if you want. I couldn't hear what you said.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. For those who are listening, and also if you have more questions that have come up after the discussion, please write to us. Please write to Mindsperm. They're on Instagram, they're on Facebook, they're on a bunch of social media. You can access them. You can write to me. You can write to Dilip sir and ask more questions if you have. Yeah, so we have about 15 more minutes, and it would be wonderful if you can give us some concluding remarks before we close off for the day.
Okay, well, my first concluding remark is to thank the organizers of Mindsperm once again. So I think it's a very wonderful initiative. They're doing the maximum possible that can be done in the middle of a pandemic when everyone is locked down. Another couple of points that I want to make is that basically we need more communication. And it's been my experience, even as a teacher, that there is not enough communication even amongst colleagues. We are getting boxed in too much. We need more communication. And one of the positive aspects that I found in Ashoka was that teachers are allowed to design their own courses. and there was time, provided we choose to use it. There was time to have a discussion with students. Now, I the thing that I feel very strongly about is that we have allowed our vocabulary to be overtaken by ideological considerations. As my students well know, I am concerned enough about it to even have designed a whole course on ideology. But I feel there are many things that we don't discuss which get occluded, which get hidden. One of the things I've mentioned to you is the fact that the working class has been wiped out from our vision. When we talk about what is happening in the country, we only talk about, making things easier for capitalists to invest and loosening up labor laws, etc. We don't really study carefully the plight of the informal sector in the country. So one thing I would request all of you to do is to make a very, very strong effort to understand how the laboring classes live and work in our country. I have posted many things about it, but you are free to go ahead and find out there. I mean, 2 years ago, a student said that, you are talking about workers, but in my experience, workers have all possible facilities and benefits. And she used the word perquisites. So I had to tell her that I'm afraid you are not informed well about it. And there are places, even in outlying areas of Delhi, where workers are living in pits dug in the ground. There's literally no place for them to live. They have to live in a pit, let alone have access to clean water, etc., etc. So look around you, look at the hazards that workers face in chemicals industries, mining industries, in the coal mining. Every time we switch on a light, remember that there are coal-fired factories working day and night to produce the electricity for us. So keep in mind the laboring classes and remember that without the labor, it's not that capitalists are being beneficiaries of labor, it's the other way around. There's a line in Marxist Communist Manifesto that it seems that the bourgeois is a bourgeois for the benefit of the working class. It's the other way around. So that is one thing to be kept in mind. And you do not have to become a communist or a Marxist or anything. I'm not preaching anything over here. I'm just asking you to pay attention to the huge section of the working population, which almost always passes out of our gaze. The second thing I want to tell you about is if you want to understand some of the most important ways in which political systems function, also do a very simple exercise. Follow the flows of violence and intimidation. I'm sorry to say, but it happens. There's always some flow. Where is it coming from? Whom is it being directed towards? Who are at the receiving end of violence? Who is at the giving end of violence? And why is it happening? This is something very, very important. You will see that certain people have a monopoly of violence, or there are vigilante groups which are being unleashed upon people. And so the structure is being maintained by a violent system, and violence is something we don't talk about because leftists indulge in violence and then they want to keep that under wraps, and rightists and neo-fascists indulge in violence and they do it with exultation. The fact is that there is all-round violence in society, and sometimes a state like the People's Republic of China, which puts a human rights activist in jail for 11 years and allows him to die of cancer without even allowing him the right to leave his country, putting his wife into under house arrest, just for one person expressing his conscience. I mean, this shows how totalitarian systems are very brittle. They're very weak. If you're so terrified of one person speaking his mind, it means that there's something weak and brittle about you. Incidentally, you should know that in China there have been people close to the establishment, high-ranking people who have denounced the leadership for being responsible for this crisis. So people in the midst of a crisis can speak up. So what I'm saying is that we should focus on the levels of intimidation and violence that are flowing through society and try to reduce it. I'm not a proponent of violence, as you all well know, but I find it very interesting that at a time when I was empathetic to Naxalism, then I was called an anti-national element. And until recently, this year, when I wanted to talk about Gandhi somewhere in a particular college in Delhi University, I was invited by the Students' Union to talk about Gandhiji. And naturally, I'm going there. People know I'm not going to preach violence. I'm going to actually talk about peace and love and friendship and non-violence, I was forbidden. Then last minute, the authorities stopped me from going there because they were intimidated. There was a group who intimidated the principal and the students' union and said, "You will not allow this man to come here and speak. Otherwise, they'll be held to pay." Now, what is going on here? So it's very interesting that even if you speak of love and friendship and communal harmony, even then you're considered anti-national by some people. So this question of intimidation and violence is a second question. The third issue is, remember that, see, people have all kinds of discussions about liberalism, what it means, neoliberalism. It's a very complex question, and I can give you stuff to read and we can have a discussion also. But right now, I'd like to say that one very interesting line of argument is by an American political theorist called Michael Walzer. I'm sure you must have heard of him. And one of his writings I recommended in my class also. He talks about liberalism and the art of separation, basically drawing lines. So here we are talking about lines and separation, but what he means is creation of certain zones in society which are relatively autonomous. And I'm pointing to the autonomy of the university, the autonomy of the individual conscience, and the autonomy of certain religious spaces, the autonomy of the judiciary and the police. If the police officers who fearlessly pursue wrongdoing are subjugated by some political person who does not want them to pursue a particular case, then the independence of prosecution is lost. If the judiciary is intimidated by whatever means, and if certain people who are compliant are rewarded by high promotions and certain people who are not compliant and who stick to their guns are demoted and threatened, then it is not good for society. In short, you need to have certain zones of independence and autonomy, and these are very important to maintain. So these are certain questions that I want you to think about. I would really like you to apply your mind to what is happening to the criminal justice system in our country. There's not enough time to talk about it, but it's a very serious issue. And it's important because we have to maintain our democracy in order to get over this pandemic and also in order to get over our pressing problems. Thank you.
We have a few more questions that have come up, and we have a little more time. There is one question that a student has asked, which says, "So one must transcend nationalism and learn to look beyond globalization." And then the student is suggesting localization and saying that should we not look towards localization at the same time and move also beyond globalization? That is one question. And then its relation to multilateral organizations, because they've proven to not work in the past. What would be the role of multilateral institutions going forward and its relationship to localization, which a lot of us are learning now that localization is a powerful thing in itself.
Yeah, so this is very, very good, and we have to attenuate. You have to be very. In medicine, they use the term titration. You have to be very careful. You have to titrate these responses because it's perfectly true that we need to be closer to our local conditions. We need, I mean, now with many, many millions of workers moving back to the villages, the question of the Indian village economy, in the manner in which Gandhi posed it 60, 70, 80 years ago, that question also becomes important. Whereas people were saying the village is a center of idiocy and backwardness, which it well may be, but also it's a place where many, many people live. The majority of the country people live there. So he paid a lot of attention to the village economy, to simplicity, to making the village a more livable place, to doing away with the evils. He never praised all of Indian culture as being totally, pure and devoid of evils. He said we must swim on the sea of our tradition, but not sink in it. So he was talking about making the village a more livable place. Now it's become a very pressing problem today, has it not? All the millions and lakhs of people who are going back to their villages. Surely we have to, and they will have to think about a method in which the village becomes more livable. If there is arsenic poisoning in the groundwater, they have to think about it. If there is regular flooding, they have to think about it. If there is too much monoculture, they have to think about it. So all questions of irrigation, atmosphere, etc., they have to think about. At the same time, remember, the air does not respect locality. The air, the atmosphere, pollution, radioactivity, carbon pollution, all these things are not, they do not respect national boundaries. I remember talking at a high level meeting of officials once in which some people were holding forth about how they will, incinerate the neighboring country, with nuclear bombs. And I simply had to point out, aren't you aware, sir, that you see radioactivity does not respect national boundaries? So while having our feet in whatever locality we do, we also remember we cannot live without other people. We human beings cannot live without touch. You need to touch people, you need to hug people, you need to be close to people, you need to have friends, you need to have love, you need all these things. We cannot live without it. So we have to pay attention to our local conditions, but we also have to remember that for local conditions to thrive, we have to rid the world of militarism, nuclear bombs, etc., etc. We have to rid the world of global warming and the chemicals that are polluting the atmosphere. Because if I'm living in a village which is next to a uranium plant or a coal firing plant, is going to be no fun living in that locality. So the problems are simultaneously global as well as local. And as regards multilateral institutions, multilateral institutions function only insofar as those various people who constitute that institution are prepared to let it function. People talk about the weakness of the United Nations, but the United Nations is only as powerful as it will be permitted to be by its own constituents. For instance, there are articles in the United Nations which permit military intervention, but they never used it. If America wanted to intervene in Iraq, they could have used the United Nations, but they didn't use it. Because Americans have a principle that we will never allow the American military to work under any other commander other than an American. So this is the situation. Multilateral institutions are required. There is an international postal service. It works. There's the international banking services. Similarly, if we want to face this pandemic, we need multilateral institutions like World Health Organization. If they have not been properly run, then we must make them better run. But we can't do away with them. We need multilateral institutions. We need the United Nations, but we need to examine why they were not functioning properly and do something that is required to make them function better.
Now, with respect to these also, I also sometimes start to think in this manner when we think about needing to get rid of militarism, needing to get rid of lifestyles that have destroyed the climate. There is one question that the student has asked, which is that we've come to feel more and more strongly that socialism and capitalism just simply don't work for our society. And in your opinion, what mixed model is possible to be implemented in today's time that will ensure better governance than, say, what socialism and capitalism has been able to achieve, or rather even destroy?
See, I'm glad you asked this question, and it cannot be answered so quickly. But you see, the thing is that these words are often these words disguise more than they reveal. What exactly do we have in mind when we talk of socialism and capitalism? When we talk of capitalism, if we think only of the United States of America and Britain, and we don't think of Scandinavia, then we are missing something. And if we talk about socialism, keeping in mind only Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, and Stalin, then perhaps we haven't understood socialism. So let us bracket that debate. It's a very necessary debate. I wish I could answer it in the course of 5 minutes, but I can't. So we'll discuss it. What I will say is that one way out of this doctrinal impasse is to simply ask the question which I posed earlier. Can we have regulation? Both under a socialist regime or a capitalist regime, you will need to have regulation. Should production take place unregulated way? Should mining take place in an unregulated way? Should there be petroleum exploration or exploration for oil without regulation? Everything has to be regulated. So should the Brazilian forest be continually cut down because of the meat producing industry? And after all, it's the Soviet Union which produced the Chernobyl disaster. So the socialism, which was the so-called socialism, which is the name of the society in the Soviet Union or China. What exactly do we mean when we use the word socialism? Do we mean a state-controlled economy? Socialism is not just a state-controlled economy. So I would say that it's recognition of social needs over and above the requirements of capital. I would not want capital, the requirements of profit making, to take precedence over every other requirement. That's what I mean. I would talk about social democracy. I would say, all right, capitalism, you cannot dismiss the market or throw away the market, but the market should function under some kind of regulation. You cannot be allowed to pollute the atmosphere, to fill poison into the soil and river water, to keep cutting down the rainforests indiscriminately, to pollute to lead to global warming in the way that has happened. You can't allow it to carry on happening just in the name of growth. Nothing will be left to grow after another decade or two. So you have to control it, and it doesn't matter whether you call it socialist or capitalist. I have put up a whole blog post on this, and I will ask Manu to send it out to you. It's on the Nordic model. Okay, and I think I've sent it to you. You can forward it to everybody. It's a Nordic model of development, which is called social democracy, where people have a greater trust in the government, and they put some pressure on the government to conform to certain practices. So we need a better regulated economic system. Once you get into the theoretical analysis part of it, then we'll have to discuss what Marx's critique of capitalism was. What is capital? It's not an antipathy to capitalists as individuals. It's a question of the degree to which capital takes over and colonizes all our life activities to the point where we are now. This is dangerous. The military industrial complex is something that keeps getting money. I'll give you the very simple example. You know, there is a conservative critique, the free marketist critique of Keynesian economics, that Keynesian economics results in the intervention of government in the business. The government has no business being in business. This is the mantra. Even today I read it in the newspaper. This is supposed to be a great deal of wisdom. But billions of dollars are spent by the American military, or for that matter, by our government, not by the military, by the governments, on the military industrial complex. Can we not call this military Keynesianism? In the name of national security, national defense, you spend billions, and sometimes these billions are being spent without proper supervision. So this is Keynesianism is going on. So therefore, we have a situation where, as Bernie Sanders says, you have socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. You do have socialism for the rich. When corporations fail, they are bailed out. You give workers, starving workers, a few $100s or whatever it is you have to give them in our country, but big corporations get a large amount of money. So the question of socialism and capitalism can be bracketed. Of course, it must be discussed. We don't have the time to discuss it now, but we must discuss it, and you have adequate resources to discuss it. But I will say, put the question of regulation forefront in your mind, and then follow where the logic takes you. Who is regulating? Where is it being regulated? Why is it not being regulated? Then you will get some answers.
Thank you, sir. One last question that a student has asked is that now that we're living through the pandemic, does it teach us to be more empathetic towards countries like Yemen, Syria, where civil war has been going on and they've been living under conditions of similar to the pandemic for all this while? And I wanted to add to that question and ask what portions of history, because you always talk about, say, soldiers' testimonies and the lived experience of people in history that's always somehow erased, and there are just events and dates in history. What can we learn from lived experiences, say, of people in Yemen and Syria, or other parts of the history that we can learn from at this point?
Well, that's a very difficult one. The point is that the number of people displaced by civil war has gone up to, well over 6 to 7 crores in the last few years. And this is basically what took place in the Middle East. And if you go back in time, you'll find that it's rooted in the American interventions in the Iran-Iraq war of the late 1970s, and then the Iraq war of George Bush the first, and then the second Iraq war. All these things led to a tremendous amount of political turmoil, and the consequence is that something to 60 to 70 million people have been displaced. And when they go rushing to several borders, then they are condemned, and people say, oh, they are converting Europe into Arabistan, etc., etc. So I'm sorry to say, but the Western world has played a very, very devious role and a very unfortunate role and violent role in the Middle East, and that is again driven by the love for the oil underneath Saudi Arabia. I mean, so, and mind you, the completely heinous and undemocratic system prevailing in Saudi Arabia has not prevented the Western powers from collaborating with it and selling it armaments and supporting it. Even in a situation like this, Mohammed bin Salman, who ordered the execution of a journalist, and you know what happened. So this selective approach towards democracy of the so-called free world has also resulted in some very, very bad crisis. Now, how do we in our part of the world, we have also had an experience of refugees. We have had an experience of partition. India was partitioned and then Pakistan was partitioned. Large number of people became stateless citizens. Millions of people had to cross borders, had to leave their homes. So people who have suffered should have some empathy for others who are also suffering. It's an opportunity. Instead of going on and on cursing and abusing people because of their communal identity, we should also think about people who are suffering. And the fact that people who have suffered similar experience should have some empathy for one another. Now, as to what we can do about it, well, there are groups, there are charitable groups which have gone out of their way to help them. I remember meeting a person who was a part of Khalsa International. I remember meeting him in London in a BBC interview in 2014. After that, I learned that Khalsa International has been helping people in Syria. They've been helping people, Rohingyas, wherever they can go, they go and help, and they don't try to preach Sikhism. They just try to help people. I really respect them. Like I respect our YIF fellow, I won't name her, but I really respect her. She's a woman of great dignity and great courage. She's not even 30 years old, and she's out there. She's helping people, in the midst of the corona epidemic. So we need to learn from this kind of empathic reaction and rational reaction. And what else can I say? I mean, you use the time to find out. I mean, there is a huge amount of information available if you choose to go out and get it of this kind of humanitarian endeavor across the world. So try to contact them, build up new links, and start a conversation. Hopefully, this conversation will continue for some time. What you build up now, this pandemic will subside maybe in some months, I don't know. But what links you build up now will stand you in good stead later on.
Thank you so much, sir. With this, we've come to the close of our discussion. I would like to thank you very much. You've always been a very forthcoming, very dedicated teacher and a very dedicated guide and a social activist. You have been an inspiration to a lot of us. Thank you so much for talking to us today. And we look forward to talking to you more and asking you more questions.
Okay, thank you, Manu, thank you, Deepak, thank you, Ayush, and all of you. And please take care of your health. Please take care of your family's health, and lots of love from me to all of you. Thank you. Okay, over and out. Okay, all right.